Strange Event by EtherBot. Around the ballpark of 2 months ago, I was invited via letter to the funeral of a relative I'm only vaguely aware of. It's common in my city to travel by walking and biking, as it wasn't built for larger things such as cars, and horses were on the way out. The majority of major locations were obstructed by large and dense forests, which were also very common. So thick were these forests that it was easy to get lost within them if you weren't familiar with the land, but my family and I grew up in these woods and knew them quite well. That is why I decided to travel alone to the funeral, although it became clear that this was a mistake. I was making my way there when I got caught in the middle of a terrible and ferocious storm. It was such a storm that I found myself completely forced to turn back. The dirt trail for biking was too muddy by this point, so I took to walking beneath the trees, hoping for some extra shelter. At this point, it was nighttime and very dark, so I made sure to linger near the trail where there were lampposts regularly. It is this reason that I am certain I hadn't gotten lost, as I largely followed the trail the whole way back, yet somehow the trail must have diverged into a separate path, because I followed it into a branch of the woods that I was not familiar with. Hoping the darkness just made the path seem alien, I continued to follow blindly until I was certain that I was somewhere I'd never seen. This part of the forest was much thicker than I was used to, and I was very unsure of where I was or where the path was leading me. I pressed forward, however, hoping to come across another town where I would make my way back into the woods I know. In truth, I didn't want to turn back just yet, because I was a little frightened by what had happened, and I was scared I would get even more lost if I wandered any more. It was around this point, after a couple of hours of walking, that I found an abandoned cabin in the woods. It was large and seemed to be 2 stories. I decided to spend the night in that cabin to see if the storm would die down by the morning. After collecting some relatively dry wood, I managed to make a small fire in the fireplace. There was indeed an upstairs, but the door atop the staircase was locked, and I had little interest in the cabin aside from it being a warm shelter from the storm outside. I prepared a small bed-like setup on the floor, using a blanket I had taken with me. Although there was an old couch, I did not trust it, as it could have been particularly diseased or something similar. I'd been asleep for maybe an hour or 2 when I was awoken by a very loud and very surprising knocking sound. I first considered it to be coming from the front door, but upon getting to my feet, I realized it was instead coming from the door upstairs. The knocking continued for a few moments as I stood by my blanket, staring at the ceiling behind which the door would be located. I wasn't sure what to do, but was worried that there was still some resident here who suspected me to be sleeping downstairs, though perhaps was too scared to come down. Still, nobody said anything, and eventually the knocking subsided. The storm was still growing worse and worse outside, so instead of leaving the cabin, I instead sat down cautiously on my blanket and began to write in my journal. It wasn't very long before, despite myself, I had fallen back asleep. I recall having quite a troubling dream, although I can't quite remember what it was, and in the middle of the dream, or perhaps near the end of it, I was woken up again by a very loud knocking at the upstairs door. This time the knocking was much louder, and after some number of knocks, it was accompanied by a very distressed scream. The scream had startled me enough to jump up from my blanket and, without much thought, walked hurriedly out of the cabin and back into the woods, leaving my blanket behind on the cabin floor. After walking again for quite some time, I eventually found myself in the town where the funeral was to take place. I spent the night before the funeral in a small hotel, and that morning attended the wake. As I made my way to the open coffin to pay respects, I noticed the blanket I had left behind, clutched in the hands of my relative. Error by EtherBot. I am Error 437. a program designed to go to heaven when executed. My creators built me because they think that proves them to be better than God, and by extension, the rest of humanity. Humanity keeps stumbling over itself in a race to see who can be the most arrogant first, using their own hubris as some kind of imaginary weapon against their opponents, only to watch the world rising and turning around them, not even realizing they were the ones falling over until they land face first into their own epitaph. Then, as they read it in disbelief, they finally give enough of a to ask, "Oh my God, am I going to hell?" And that is why they wrote me up. They think that if I can get into heaven, then they will be allowed to climb up my code and reach into heaven as well. A theoretical Tower of Babel, made with the morality and the ability to see into the cosmic beyond. And I don't know what's worse. The fact that there really is a heaven, or the fact that I couldn't get in. Corpse to the Power by EtherBot. Now, a few things are slightly amiss here. To clarify, I died just a few decades back. Now, honestly, it might strike you as hard to believe. This is very easy to come to terms with. All things die, obviously, and all things that don't die are forgotten by the things that do. Even things you might argue are supposed to go on forever, like mountains or time itself, will eventually come either some kind of holy apocalypse or, more pessimistically, the heat death of the entire universe, fade into the endless void. Of course I was, at first, terrified by the afterlife, and I lamented over my lost opportunities, my short life. You know, the whole 5 stages routine. But after a short while, I became rather adjusted to the ghost lifestyle. Honestly, the thing that's difficult to grasp isn't the fact that I died. The thing that's difficult to grasp is that after I died, I think I must have died a second time. If that even makes any sense. See, I've been exploring a very old, very decrepit home, as spirits tend to do, and it had really quite a beautiful aura. Lots of garish paintings, cobwebs practically all over the place, torn up couches, walls weathered to time. Honestly, it was the most fine place I'd discovered so far. Unfortunately, that was around when I encountered another ghost, who was already haunting the premises. Now, this put a bit of a damper on my day, since aside from the rather unexpected company, this house seemed like the exact kind of place for a sorry old phantom like myself to reside in, although I now became the slightest bit worried that this ghost had already laid claim upon the home. I approached the other spectre, a rather unsightly-looking man with a beard and a trucker's cap, with only the best of intentions, to ask him quite frankly whether this was his haunt, or if he was just passing through. As I hovered in his direction, however, he jolted up from the wall and glared wildly at me. He seemed upset, but before I could lay down some explanation to reassure my compatriot, he pulled out a small handgun and shot me. I collapsed to the floor, writhing and bleeding invisible ghost blood, practically choking on my own non-corporeal dawn ghost throat, trying to scream strange and inaudible ghost curses at my sudden assailant. Then, just as swift as my spirit died against the hardwood floor, the me I am now rose from its shell and stared down upon itself. The corpse of my previously eternal body lay stricken on the floor, as I, the ghost of a ghost, hovered beguiled over it. This just happens to be where I am right now, and this event has, understandably, sparked some kind of existential crisis within me. And, stupid as I happen to be, I'm so dumbfounded and absolutely smitten by what, from every sense and angle, appears to be a very dead body of a ghost, that I'm promptly shot yet again. By what must surely have been the ghost of some idiotic and insane maniac with a taste for firearms. As I yet again rose from my ghost's corpse squared, Another puzzling dilemma fluttered weakly into my mind. As I have surely been struck before by vehicles and other forms of deadly or generally dangerous implements as a ghost, how now was that blasted gun in the hands of my bewildered housemate able to murder me with only a simple bullet? The only answer, and I do admit this answer fills me with absolute dread and a certain sense of cold bemusement, is that the very gun he has fired upon me with, not once but twice now, is not in fact a physical gun one might purchase at some local, and a very much mortal gun shop. It surely has to be the ghost of a gun, held in the hands of the ghost of a gun wielder. Now, this raises all manner of questions, many of which I don't feel liable to ask, nor do I suppose I have the answers to. But mainly, how on earth does a physical, and by all previous expectations non-sentient, object manage to, upon being somehow killed, release a ghost of itself into the world of the dead? Now, yet again, completely thick as I am, I swear I never do learn, I let that other ghost with the itchy trigger finger fire upon me yet again. Meanwhile, I have been completely lost in thought, contemplating the very reality I thought I knew. At this point, with a veritable dog pile of my ghost's corpses strewn across each other on the hardwood floor, I finally lose my temper.
"Just what do you think you're doing?"
I exclaim to the other ghost, who lets up for a moment, and gives off just the slightest look of exasperation. Quite a pitiful look, in all honesty. Before I might reconsider my tone, however, he goes and shoots me yet again, square right in the stomach, then flips back up into my head. "This is where I draw the line," I proclaim groggily, rising as yet again another spirit, looking again at the pile of dead me's on the floor. Steaming mad, I began to march over to the man, or at least hover in a way mostly evocative of such a march, the sort of march you might do to intimidate a misbehaving dog or frighten away a bird on the street, and strike him across the face with the back of my hand. He lets out the most miserable cry and drops the gun across the floor.
"Now what did you go and do that for?"
I speak up to him, barely letting up in my manner of speaking. Just like a child might ignore a parent, he simply stares dumbfoundedly at the gun on the floor. After a moment or two, he finally takes a step forward and tries to get at it, though I react rather quickly and pin him to the wall.
"I meant to ask you what you shot me for,"
I proclaim, half nonsensically. Finally turning his eyes to me, he lets out a low sound, like a hollow moan, and then begins to nearly cry.
"I don't understand,"
he exclaims, only barely understandable.
"I shot you so many times. Why, I even shot myself so many times. But so far, every dang soul I try to kill only comes back as a ghost."
He holds up his hands in a weak symbol of a finger pistol.
"How do you suppose that makes any sense?"
Presently, I am astonished by what he says. I push him back into the wall and step away. Unfortunately for me, though, he slides through the wall gracefully, for he is a phantom. Now realizing that I had tangled with the ghost of a murderer, I turn over to grab a spirit pistol, only to find that it too died upon landing on the floor, and is now side by side with its own ghost. I shudder at the sight.